Hello, my name's Rob Edwards. Welcome back to my YouTube channel, and today we're talking about crossovers. We're taking a canter through crossovers. Crossovers are amongst my favourite thing for any kind of media to do. I love a good crossover. And today I just thought I would just talk about some of my favourites, some of the more interesting ones throughout the history of crossovers. And I thought I'd share that with you. Full disclosure, the reason that I'm doing a video about crossovers is that my new book coming out on the 8th of March is called The Crossover Paradox. I will talk very briefly about it towards the end of the video, but for now let's get on to the other crossovers that I want to talk about. My first love of crossovers came from comic books. There were comic books crossing over with each other for as long as I've been reading comic books, and probably a good deal longer than that. There were books like DC Comics Presents, where Superman every issue would meet another hero from around the universe and they would have an adventure together, or The Brave and the Bold for Batman. On the Marvel side, there were comic books where Spider-Man crossed over with various Marvel heroes, and there was another one where The Thing crossed over with various different Marvel heroes. It was the bread and butter of comic books. It is just a way to spice things up. What if this character met that character? What if they got into a fight? Who would win? All these fun questions like that would come up with a crossover. But for the most part, mostly, crossovers would happen within the continuity of one publisher or another. But this all changed, for me anyway. I know there were earlier ones than this, but the first one I encountered in 1981 with a crossover between Superman from DC and Spider-Man from Marvel. I would have been about 10 when this came out. I was smart enough to have worked out by now there were two different companies and people didn't meet from the two universes, but then they did. This comic book suggested that Superman and Spider-Man were in the same universe and sort of vaguely knew each other in passing, and they team up to defeat Dr. Doom and Parasite. This seemed like a missed opportunity for me here, because Dr. Doom, while a brilliant villain, is not really a Spider-Man villain, and Parasite, while it is a Superman villain, it's not really top-tier Superman villain. I think it would have been far more interesting to have paired them up against, I don't know, Lex Luthor and Dr. Octopus. That said, I loved this as a kid. I love this idea. Oh, isn't this exciting? Something really rare, something that doesn't normally happen very much. Superman and Spider-Man together at the same time. This comic was not great. I mean, looking back at it now, it wasn't amazing. But at the time, it was absolutely astonishing to me as a 10-year-old. I could not have been more excited. Except, of course, I was more excited when next year we got X-Men and Teen Titans. Now, these were both books that I read and enjoyed pretty much all the time. So to see two of my favourite teams meeting and fighting against Darkseid and the Dark Phoenix was absolutely amazing. And it was written by Chris Claremont, so of course the characterisation of the X-Men was spot on. And the Teen Titans also came out of it pretty well as well. Again, a bit of an oddity that Darkseid, not really a Titans villain, but certainly if we're looking for sort of cosmic entities for the two teams to fight against, Dark Phoenix is the classic one for the X-Men side of things. And I suppose Darkseid is of a similar threat level for the DC universe. Not the only Marvel DC crossover, of course. If you are a comic book fan like me and grew up in the 90s, then you would have come across the Amalgam comics. This was a really interesting idea where they would pit two characters, one from each universe, against each other, and fans would vote for who would win in the fight against them. Of course, it turned into a popularity contest more than it turned into a true representation of the different power levels of those heroes. There were different mashups where clearly the wrong hero won, but just they happened to be more popular. And it resulted in this kind of amalgam comics where not only were there people crossing over, but inside the people they would cross over. So we had Dark Claw, who was a mix of Batman and Wolverine, and the Super Soldier who was Captain America and Superman, and so forth. As a one-off thing, it was really, really fun. Not always terribly well written, but it was really entertaining to watch these characters cross over. The high point of intercompany crossover for me is almost certainly Avengers Justice League of America. This was brilliant, and not least because of George Perez's art. George Perez is apparently not terribly well right now, and there has been a movement to get this reprinted, because I don't think it was ever printed since it first came out in 2003. I, of course, am fortunate to have all 4 issues of the original, so I don't need to go hunting for the reprints. But if you ever get a chance to read it, it really is extraordinarily well done to have this huge a cast and have so many great moments for different characters in both teams. I love Avengers JLA, and because of George Perez's art, it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Of course, big crossover events weren't just across universes. There has been a long tradition of big event comics crossing over different lines within a particular publisher's house. So Civil War, Inferno that I've got here was a great crossover between X-Men and X-Factor and all the X books together at the same time in the 80s. This was a really exciting book at the time because it had a real impact on characters. But I loved Inferno. It ran for about a year and I was super excited pretty much throughout. More exciting, though, because I am a DC guy, was more recently 2009's Blackest Night series. This was Jeff Johns at his highest. I think he's probably tailed off a little bit in a lot of people's opinions in more recent years, but this was the culmination of a years-long run on Green Lantern, building up to this huge event where various dead heroes and villains were brought back by Black Lantern rings, and the heroes had to fight for the very existence of life in the universe against the Black Lantern Corps. And while some of the tie-in issues, and this is honestly true of a lot of comic book events, crossover events, a lot of the tie-in books were a bit weak. The core story of Blackest Night was absolutely fantastic. I could go on about in-house crossovers. DC had Armageddon, Final Crisis, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Crisis on Multiple Earths. They like having crises. The Identity Crisis was sort of a crossover. But let's move on to other crossovers where more unlikely characters met. Still, I'm afraid, sticking a little bit with DC, here we have Batman Judge Dredd. I read the first one, Judgment on Gotham, and really enjoyed it. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I don't know that I read any of the later Batman Judge Dredd comic books, but certainly if they were as good as the first one, they are well worth a read. Batman did have a while there crossing over with all sorts of things. Batman vs. Predator was the original anyway. Again, there were multiples of them, but the original Batman vs. Predator was amazing. I loved the original Batman Predator. And the Superman Aliens book was really interesting as well. In this arena, I was talking about this with some friends of mine. Ricardo Victoria, who is a fellow writer, check out his Tempest Blades books, told me I had to mention Batman Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I'm a little too old for TMNT to really have hit my radar, if I'm honest, so I've never read this, but he assures me it is absolutely fantastic. So if Turtles and Batman are your thing, check it out, I would suggest. Tell them Ricardo sent you. I also love this crossover, Star Trek and Doctor Who. Two great sci-fi shows, and they could do this in comic books because they don't have to worry about getting actors back. This is the strength of the comic book crossover. They can pull characters from anywhere, and as long as they can be drawn, they can be used. I mean, rights pending, of course. So we don't have to worry about trying to get Patrick Stewart and Matt Smith in the same room, or Tom Baker and William Shatner, because there is a brief period of crossover between earlier iterations of the two franchises within this crossover story. And here they team up to beat both the Borg and the Cybermen. and I really enjoyed this. It was a lot of fun. Obviously not really in continuity of either show, but a fun opportunity to see these characters interact. So I would recommend Assimilation to you. Most recently on my comic book list here, we have some recent crossovers that DC has done with Looney Tunes characters, because they're both owned by Warner Brothers. And again, they're not really my cup of tea, so I've not read these, but from what I understand from reviews I've seen, these were fairly well received, actually, considering what they are. Generally speaking, the take on the Looney Tunes character is a bit more adult, a bit darker in tone typically, and we end up with some really interesting takes on these characters. And if that sounds like fun, maybe worth seeking out. I'd say I've never read them, but I hear good things. So, crossovers in comic books are really my thing. This is something that I have enjoyed and loved for all of my reading life, essentially. But it's not the only place that crossovers happen. We will revisit comic book characters time and again through this video, but let's take a brief step away from them to talk about Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein. This is another one that a friend recommended I include in my video. Again, I haven't seen it. To be honest, as a Brit, Abbott and Costello really kind of passed me by. I've watched the Who's On First sketch, but that's about all I know about Abbott and Costello. But I am told this is an exciting piece of crossover fiction where Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. And from the poster, and this is all I know about it, the poster really, the Wolfman, Dracula, and the Monster also making appearances. So this was a pretty impressive piece of work at the time. 1948 this came out. And also my friend who was recommending this to me also pointed out that he'd heard anyway that this movie, Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, was what got Tarantino into this idea of crossing over genres being an exciting and successful thing to attempt to achieve. Steering clear for the most part still of comic book crossovers in movies, we have AVP, Alien vs. Predator. Although, in fairness, that was also a comic book crossover. They also crossed over Terminator with at least one of these. But I confess I've only seen the first one. AVP didn't really do it for me, and I don't really seek out any of the sequels and spin-offs of this franchise. But again, it is a taking the idea of the crossover and doing what's most exciting with it. Iconic characters, smashing them together and seeing what happens. In this case, what happened was a substandard movie. But sometimes what happens is far more exciting than that. Still in the movie crossover world, and still not talking about superheroes just yet, we have a rather fleeting crossover of sorts in 1999, Star Wars The Phantom Menace, when we had a brief glimpse of the extraterrestrial creatures in the Senate building. So these three ETs were quite close to the Wookiee senators, I believe, and fleetingly showed up there. This sort of paying off the fact that in E.T., the movie, the character E.T. Stumbles across a character in a Yoda costume because it's Halloween and seems to recognise him. So this idea, carrying across this idea that they are in the same universe as each other. Also, Indiana Jones. Again, if you're into your movies, you probably know this already, but there is a fleeting glimpse in an Indiana Jones movie of a hieroglyph of R2-D2 and C-3PO on one of the tombs that Indy raids. No, it doesn't raid. That's a different franchise. One of the tombs that Indy explores has this hieroglyph in there. Again, showing that we're crossing over Star Wars and Indiana Jones and E.T. as well, all in the same universe, apparently. But if we're talking crossover movies, we have to talk the Avengers. It is hard to remember, I think, perhaps, 10 years after the fact, quite what a big thing the Avengers movie was, Avengers Assemble as it was called in the UK. Because we'd had some tentpole movies with Iron Man, Thor and Captain America leading their movies. These were big characters, big enough to drive their own narratives. Would they work bringing them together? Would this still be an exciting movie? We'd introduced Black Widow and Hawkeye fleetingly in these movies as well. And Hulk had also had a movie, but they recast him and there's a whole rights thing. And whatever has happened with Joss Whedon in later years, there is no getting away from the fact that this original Avengers movie was absolutely magnificent. Every character was given an opportunity to really show off what they do. We had some brilliant Thor moments, some brilliant Iron Man moments, excellent Black Widow moments in here. Hawkeye possibly drawing the shortest straw from this, but that's something of a theme in Avengers movies, possibly. But I did love the Avengers movie, and it was very, very exciting to see it. So we've talked movies, we've talked comic books. Let's have a quick talk about some TV crossovers. And the first one, I don't know if I'm necessarily bending the definition of crossover here, because this is an episode of Doctor Who called The Five Doctors, which came out in 1983 to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the show. And, I mean, wow. This thing, I was 13 at the time. I was just newly into Doctor Who. I'd only got into it with the Fifth Doctor. I'd missed the whole long scarf period of Doctor Who. And to see my Doctor crossing over with earlier selves. I'd seen a couple of stories from Patrick Troughton, a couple of stories from John Pertwee on BBC Two in a weird dead slot in their timetable. But to see them do their thing in full colour on my TV at sort of prime time was so exciting. And also Tom Baker had some clips from Shada, and Richard Hurnell was playing William Hartnell. But these three, Peter Davison, John Pertwee and Patrick Troughton, really carried this for me, and I loved it. I recorded it from the TV onto a VHS tape. Was it Betamax? I think we had a Betamax player, actually. And then I recorded the audio onto an audio cassette, and I used to listen to this all the time. There was a time, 40 years ago, when I could quote huge chunks of this show to you. I shall not attempt it today. But is it a crossover? It is taking its own show and crossing over with itself in a kind of time-based... I think it's a crossover. It counts for me, so there we go. And that's why this also counts too. Deep Space Nine had this episode Trials and Tribulations, where Sisko and his team were put into the original series episode, The Trouble with Tribbles, and was a huge, huge fun. I really enjoyed it. Not a crossover I've actually got much attachment to this one. I have watched it. This is the Supernatural crossover with Scooby-Doo. Of course I grew up on Scooby-Doo, who didn't? But Supernatural kind of passed me by. I have watched this one single episode of it, and it was fun to watch the Supernatural cast kind of bring a more kind of adult tone to some Scooby-Doo adventuring, and I really enjoyed that, but I had no idea who any of these characters were outside the Scooby-Doo verse. And of course we have crossovers from various sitcoms. This is usually a smaller thing. Blink and you'll miss it, or if you didn't follow the other sitcom, you might not even realise it's a crossover. So here we have an example of Brooklyn Nine-Nine crossing over with New Girl. Friends did this several times with several contemporary shows, including the one that Phoebe's sister was on. And there is also crossover outside of sitcom universes, but more dramatic crossovers. There's a whole Sent Elsewhere theory. I don't have a picture for this, so forgive the fact that Jake Peralta is here on screen while I'm talking about Sent Elsewhere. But essentially, during the early 90s, I think, Sent Elsewhere was a huge medical drama set in a hospital, and occasionally we'd have guest characters make an appearance, basically actors playing the same role that they played in other shows of the era, of that time. And I think there was a crossover with a character from MASH, and there was probably NYPD Blue, maybe. I'm making that up. Don't quote me on that. But essentially, Sent Elsewhere crossed over with so many other shows, and those shows crossed over with so many other shows, that you ended up with a situation where essentially most of 90s television were allegedly in the same cinematic universe, doing it before even Marvel tried it. Speaking of superheroes, of course I have to mention the CW's regular crossovers with their CW shows. Love 'em or hate 'em, The crossovers were always the most exciting part of the CW shows for me, and Crisis of Infinite Earths, taking its name from the 1985 comic book event crossover of the same name, was an opportunity to bring together a lot of characters and have a lot of cameos from strange places. I loved seeing Brandon Routh reprising his Superman role. I loved seeing Tom Welling very briefly as Clark from Smallville, a guest appearance from Lucifer in a blink and you'll miss it kind of moment, and lots of other weird and wonderful. I couldn't believe we got a character from the Birds of Prey TV show make a fleeting appearance as well. It was extremely well done, and I don't think we'll ever see a crossover quite like it on TV again. Well, not for a while anyway. I was trying to rack my brains thinking of book crossovers, and one of my friends said, "Oh, you must mention Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys crossing over." And I sort of have read both books for both these characters as a kid. I hadn't realised that they'd crossed over. And they have. I did a quick search on Wikipedia. In 1988, here we have the first of several super mysteries featuring both characters. Interesting, they crossed over first in their TV shows. 10 years earlier, in the 70s, there was a crossover between Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys on TV, but it was only in 1988 when this book... Crossovers are, of course, easier to achieve with books that are now outside of copyright when they're in the public domain, and that's why crossovers like The Tangled Skein, where Sherlock Holmes investigates Dracula, is such a big thing. I have not read the book, but I have listened to the Big Finish audio play, starring Nick Briggs as Sherlock Holmes and Richard Earle as Watson. And while I do actually really enjoy the Big Finish Sherlock Holmes plays, I'm not a huge Dracula fan, if I'm honest. The vampire thing leaves me a bit cold. So I kind of enjoyed this, but it wasn't my favourite thing ever. So there we go. That's a list of some of my favourite crossovers, all in honour of my book, The Crossover Paradox. It is the sequel to my novel, The Ascension Machine, which came out a couple of years ago, set in a college for alien superheroes. And this, The Crossover Paradox, follows into Gray's second year at the school. I don't have my author copies yet, otherwise I'll be showing you that as well. But this comes out on March the 8th. And if you like grand adventures with superheroes in a science fiction setting, it is, I think, a lot of fun. It's available on Kindle and in paperback formats, coming out on 8th of March. Anyway, enough advertising. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope you had fun with that. My canter through crossovers. I'm a little out of breath having gone through all of that. I hope you had a good time. If you have any crossovers that you think I should have mentioned, throw them in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Any crossovers you think I should absolutely be watching or reading, I want to know about them, so let me know. If there are any crossovers I should definitely avoid, let me know that as well. There are so many more I could have mentioned. I'm out of breath. Time for me to be done. So I will catch you next time. Cheers.